No one knows who the first was to slash his throat with a piece of flint, take a handful of poisoned berries, or intentionally drop his spear to the ground in battle. Nor do we know who first jumped impulsively or after thought from a great cliff, walked without food into an ice storm, or stepped into the sea with no intention of coming back. Death, as Seneca states, has always lain close at hand, yet it is a mystery why the first to kill himself did. Was it a sudden impulse or prolonged disease? An inner voice commanding death? Perhaps shame or the threat of capture by an enemy tribe? Despair? Exhaustion? Pressure from others to spare common resources of food and land? No one knows. It is unlikely that Homo sapiens was the first to think of suicide or act on the thought of it. Indeed, from an evolutionary perspective, this would seem rather arbitrary, given the sophistication of the hominids before us. The Cro-Magnons, we believe, were skilled hunters, makers of blades and spears, platers of rope, users of fire, and reflective, ingenious inventors of remarkable art forms and elaborate burial rituals. And there was Homo neanderthalensis before them, and the hunting apes such as chimpanzees, known to be aggressive, social, and cognitively complex toolmakers. At what point did self-awareness enter into the life of the brain? When did a conscious, deliberate intent to die veer off from the borderlands of extreme recklessness and impetuous, life-threatening taking of risks? Violence and recklessness, profound social withdrawal, and self-mutilation are not, as we shall hear, unique to our species. But perhaps suicide is. We will never know who or why or how the first to kill himself did, or herself. We will never know that either. But it is very likely that once suicide occurred and others were cognizant of it, the act was repeated. In part because the reasons and means would remain integral to the psychological and physical environment, and in part because animals and humans learn, to considerable extent, through imitation. Suicide, dangerously, has a contagious aspect. It has, as well, for the vulnerable, an indisputable appeal as the solution of last resort. Recorded observations about suicide are, of necessity, far more recent than its first occurrences. Society's attitudes, as captured in its literature, laws, and religious sanctions, provide one window into our collective reactions to self-murder. They give a historical perspective to the evolution of our perceptions about suicide, perceptions that have varied from our seeing it as an accepted and valued event to treating it as a sin or a crime, or conceptualizing it as the consequence of adverse circumstances or pathological mental states. Certainly, cultures have varied in their notions of self-inflicted death. Several, for example the Eskimo, Norse, Samoan, and Crow Indian, accepted and even encouraged altruistic self-sacrifice among the elderly and sick. Among the Inuit Eskimos of St. Lawrence Island, if an individual requested suicide 3 times, relatives were obligated to assist in the killing. The person seeking suicide dressed in ritual death garb and then was killed in a destroying place set aside specifically for that purpose. To save commonly held resources of food or to allow a nomadic society to move on unhindered by the physically ill or elderly, some societies gave tacit, if not explicit, approval to suicide. No early cultural or religious sanctions were attached to the suicides recorded in the Old Testament or to the only one, that of Judas Iscariot, described in the New. Attitudes toward suicide hardened during the early years of Christianity. Most of these deaths, like those of the ancient Greeks portrayed by Homer, were seen as matters of honor, actions taken to avoid falling into the hands of a military enemy, to atone for wrongdoing, or to uphold a religious or philosophical principle. Hannibal, for example, took poison rather than be captured or dishonored, as did Demosthenes, Cassius, Brutus, Cato, and scores of others. Socrates, who refused to renounce his teachings and beliefs, drank hemlock. Gladiators thrust wooden sticks or spears down their throats, or forced their heads into the spokes of moving carts in order that they might choose their own, rather than another's, time and way of dying. Beliefs about suicide varied considerably in ancient Greece. The Stoics and Epicureans believed strongly in the individual's right to choose the means and time of his death. Others were less accepting of the idea. In Thebes and Athens, suicide was not against the law, but those who killed themselves were denied funeral rites, and the hand that had been used for the act was severed from the arm. Aristotle regarded suicide as an act of cowardice, as well as an act against the state. So too did Pythagoras, although, according to Heraclitus, Pythagoras starved himself to death. Roman law actively prohibited suicide and further prohibited the passing on to heirs of the suicide's possessions and estates. The Catholic Church from its earliest days opposed suicide, and, during the 6th and 7th centuries, codified its opposition by excommunicating and denying funeral rites to those who died by their own hand. Suicide was never justifiable, wrote St. Augustine in an authoritative argument for the Church, because it violated the 6th commandment of God, "Thou shalt not kill."